Here's something that sounds like it came straight out of a spy thriller, except it's completely true. In the middle of World War II, while Nazi Germany was fighting a global war on multiple fronts, two of its most powerful intelligence agencies were locked in a vicious shadow war against each other. They weren't fighting the Allies. They were fighting each other. The Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service, and the Gestapo, along with its sister organization, the SD, were spending enormous resources spying on each other, sabotaging each other's operations, and actively working to destroy each other. It was espionage against espionage, intelligence agency versus intelligence agency, Germans hunting Germans. And the truly remarkable thing is that this internal war probably did more damage to Nazi Germany than many Allied operations. This is the story of how Hitler's spy agencies became so obsessed with destroying each other that they forgot who the real enemy was. To understand this bizarre situation, we need to go back to the early days of the Nazi regime and understand what these organizations were and why they hated each other so much. The Abwehr was the older, more traditional organization. It was the intelligence and counterintelligence service of the German armed forces, the Wehrmacht. The word Abwehr literally means defense, and the organization had its roots going back to the First World War. By the time Hitler came to power in 1933, the Abwehr was a well-established military intelligence service, staffed by career officers, many from aristocratic backgrounds, men who saw themselves as professionals serving Germany rather than the Nazi Party. The head of the Abwehr from 1935 until 1944 was Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, and he's one of the most enigmatic figures of the entire war. Canaris was a small, white-haired man who looked more like a kindly grandfather than a spy master. He loved dogs, kept dachshunds as pets, and was known for his charm and his ability to speak multiple languages. But behind that gentle exterior was a brilliant, devious mind. Canaris was a master manipulator, someone who knew how to play political games, how to tell people what they wanted to hear while concealing his true thoughts. And here's the fascinating thing about Canaris. Many historians believe he was secretly working against Hitler, that he used his position as head of German intelligence to actually sabotage the Nazi war effort. Whether that's true or not is still debated, but what's certain is that Canaris created an organization that was very different from the fanatical Nazi institutions around it. The Abwehr under Canaris became something of a refuge for Germans who were uncomfortable with the Nazi regime. It recruited officers from the old German military establishment, aristocrats, intellectuals, people who believed in traditional German values rather than Nazi ideology. Many of them were conservatives who had initially supported Hitler as a bulwark against communism, but had grown increasingly horrified by Nazi brutality and extremism. The Abwehr had sections focused on espionage, sabotage, counterintelligence, and even guerrilla warfare. It ran spy networks across Europe, North Africa, and beyond. On paper, it was Nazi Germany's eyes and ears in the world. Now let's talk about the other side of this equation. The Gestapo, whose name came from Geheime Staatspolizei, meaning secret state police, was created by the Nazis specifically as a tool of political repression. This wasn't a traditional intelligence service. It was a secret police force designed to hunt down enemies of the Nazi state, to terrorize the population into submission, to root out any opposition or dissent. The Gestapo could arrest anyone without warrant, torture suspects without oversight, and send people to concentration camps without trial. They were feared throughout Germany and occupied Europe, and that fear was deliberate. The Gestapo wanted people to be terrified because terror was their primary weapon. Closely linked to the Gestapo was the SD, the Sicherheitsdienst, or security service, which was the intelligence arm of the SS. The SD was created by Reinhard Heydrich, one of the most sinister figures in Nazi Germany. Heydrich was tall, blond, athletic, a skilled fencer and pilot, exactly the kind of person Nazi propaganda liked to celebrate as the Aryan ideal. But he was also utterly ruthless, completely amoral, and frighteningly intelligent. His nickname was the Blonde Beast, and even other Nazi leaders feared him. Heydrich built the SD into a massive intelligence network focused on internal security, ideological surveillance, and hunting down anyone deemed an enemy of the Reich. The SD and Gestapo operated under Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS and one of the most powerful men in Nazi Germany. Himmler was Hitler's most loyal follower, a man obsessed with racial ideology and creating what he saw as a pure Germanic empire. Under Himmler and Heydrich, the SS, SD, and Gestapo became an empire within an empire, a state within a state, answerable only to Hitler himself. And they wanted more power, more authority, more control, which meant they saw the Abwehr, with its independent military intelligence role, as competition that needed to be eliminated. So you had two fundamentally different organizations. The Abwehr was military, traditional, staffed by officers who valued professionalism and saw themselves as serving Germany. The Gestapo and SD were party organizations, fanatically Nazi, staffed by true believers who saw themselves as serving Hitler and the racial vision of National Socialism. The Abwehr operated under military law and military discipline. The Gestapo and SD operated outside normal legal constraints, using terror and brutality as standard tools. These weren't just rival agencies. They represented fundamentally different visions of what Germany was and should be. The rivalry started almost immediately when Hitler came to power, but it intensified dramatically as the war went on. Both organizations were supposed to be working toward German victory, but they spent an enormous amount of energy fighting each other instead. They spied on each other constantly. The SD had agents inside the Abwehr, and the Abwehr had agents inside the SD. They wiretapped each other's phones. They intercepted each other's communications. They built files on each other's personnel, looking for anything that could be used to discredit their rivals. This wasn't just paranoia or bureaucratic rivalry. There were real ideological and political stakes. The SS and SD saw the Abwehr as politically unreliable, insufficiently Nazi, possibly even treasonous. And they were right to be suspicious, because the Abwehr really did harbor people who opposed Hitler. Multiple assassination plots against Hitler were organized by Abwehr officers. The most famous, the July 20th plot in 1944, involved numerous Abwehr personnel. Canaris himself, while carefully maintaining plausible deniability, was connected to resistance circles. The Abwehr leaked information to the Allies, sabotaged Nazi operations, and protected people the Gestapo wanted to arrest. Let me give you some specific examples of how this shadow war played out, because the details are absolutely incredible. The Abwehr and SD both ran spy networks in neutral countries, and they actively worked to undermine each other's operations. In Spain, which was officially neutral but friendly to Germany, both organizations had large stations. They competed for the same Spanish sources, tried to recruit each other's agents, and fed false information to their rivals. Spanish double agents played the two organizations against each other, collecting money from both while providing useful intelligence to neither. In Switzerland, the situation was even more complex. The Abwehr had a major operation there run by Hans Bernd Gisevius, who was actually working with the American OSS and passing information to the Allies. The SD knew something fishy was going on, but couldn't quite prove it. They assigned agents to surveil the Abwehr's people in Switzerland, which meant German intelligence officers were following other German intelligence officers through the streets of Bern and Zurich. It was a counterintelligence nightmare, except the nightmare was self-created. They were investigating themselves. One of the most bizarre episodes involved Operation North Pole in the Netherlands. The Abwehr had successfully penetrated British intelligence operations in the Netherlands, capturing multiple British agents and their radio equipment. For nearly 2 years, from 1942 to 1944, the Abwehr ran what's called a radio game, using captured radios to feed false information back to London while pretending to be the captured agents. It was actually quite a successful operation from a counterintelligence perspective. But the SD was jealous. They wanted credit for the operation. They wanted to take it over. So instead of working together, the two organizations fought over who controlled the captured agents, who got credit for the operation, and who would report the successes to Hitler. The rivalry extended into agent recruitment and handling. Both organizations recruited spies from the same pool of potential agents, often approaching the same individuals. Sometimes they'd unknowingly recruit the same person, creating situations where a single spy was reporting to both the Abwehr and the SD, who both thought they had an exclusive source. These spies quickly figured out they could play the two agencies against each other, demanding more money and better treatment by threatening to work exclusively for the rival organization. The internal war got even more absurd when it came to operations against the Soviet Union. Both the Abwehr and the SD ran intelligence operations in the East, and they competed viciously for resources, for authority, and for credit. They recruited from the same populations of Soviet prisoners of war and defectors. They ran similar networks, and critically, they didn't share information with each other. Intelligence gathered by the Abwehr might not reach the SD, and vice versa. This meant that German military commanders were sometimes getting contradictory intelligence assessments from their two intelligence services, with no way to know which one was accurate. Heydrich, who ran the SD until his assassination in 1942, was particularly aggressive in going after the Abwehr. He assembled a massive file on Canaris, documenting every contact, every meeting, every suspicious activity. He was convinced that Canaris was either incompetent or treasonous, possibly both. But Canaris was a master of bureaucratic infighting. He maintained excellent relationships with key military commanders. He provided intelligence that made him valuable to Hitler. And he was incredibly careful, never leaving a paper trail that could definitively prove disloyalty. After Heydrich's death, his successor as head of the SD was Ernst Kaltenbrunner, an Austrian Nazi who was even more brutal but less intelligent than Heydrich had been. Kaltenbrunner continued the campaign against the Abwehr with single-minded determination. He wanted the entire organization dissolved and absorbed into the SD, and he slowly, methodically built his case, documenting every Abwehr failure, every suspicious contact, every hint of disloyalty. The SD strategy was to highlight Abwehr failures while concealing their own. When Abwehr operations went wrong, and in intelligence work operations go wrong all the time, the SD would write detailed reports to Hitler explaining how Abwehr incompetence had damaged the Reich. When SD operations failed, those failures were quietly buried. It was a propaganda campaign waged through internal memos and reports, and it was devastatingly effective. One of the major scandals the SD used against the Abwehr involved an operation in Turkey. The Abwehr had a major station in Ankara, the Turkish capital, and they were running numerous agents throughout the Middle East. One of their agents, codenamed Cicero, was actually the valet to the British ambassador in Turkey. This agent was photographing top-secret British documents and selling them to the Germans. It should have been an intelligence coup. But there were problems. The intelligence was so good that some German officials suspected it was too good, that Cicero must be a British plant feeding disinformation. The SD predictably argued loudly that the whole thing was an Abwehr disaster, that they had been fooled by the British. The truth, which came out after the war, was that Cicero was real and the documents were genuine. But because of the rivalry between the Abwehr and SD, because neither trusted the other, and because both were more interested in scoring political points than in using the intelligence effectively, much of the information Cicero provided was ignored or dismissed. German intelligence was literally paying money for British secrets, and then not using them because of internal politics. It would be funny if it wasn't so tragic. The constant internal warfare had serious operational consequences. It meant duplication of effort, with both organizations running similar operations in the same locations. It meant lack of coordination, with the right hand not knowing what the left hand was doing. It meant that intelligence wasn't being shared, so decision-makers didn't get complete pictures of situations. And it meant that enormous resources, time, money, and manpower were being devoted to internal rivalry instead of to fighting the actual enemy. Think about what this meant in practical terms. You had German intelligence officers whose job should have been to spy on the British, French, Americans, or Soviets, but who instead spent their time spying on other German intelligence officers. You had agents in the field who had to worry not just about enemy counterintelligence, but also about their colleagues from rival German agencies trying to undermine them. You had reports and analysis that were colored not by objective assessment, but by the desire to make your organization look good and the rival organization look bad. The Abwehr also became a center of active resistance to Hitler, and this is where things get really interesting from a historical perspective. Multiple plots to assassinate Hitler involved Abwehr officers. Hans Oster, Canaris's deputy and closest colleague, was deeply involved in resistance activities. He leaked information about German military plans to the Allies. He warned the Dutch and Norwegians before German invasions. He protected Jews and other persecuted people by giving them Abwehr credentials or by providing them with false papers. The Abwehr employed people whose primary job seemed to be undermining the Nazi regime from within. This shouldn't have been possible. The Gestapo and SD were supposed to root out exactly this kind of disloyalty, but the Abwehr had something the Gestapo didn't have, which was legitimate military authority and the protection of the Wehrmacht command structure. Arresting Abwehr officers wasn't as simple as arresting civilians or even regular soldiers. It required navigating military law and military politics. And Canaris was extremely good at exploiting these bureaucratic protections to shield his people. But the SD never stopped hunting. They knew something was wrong with the Abwehr. They could sense the disloyalty even if they couldn't quite prove it. And every time they found evidence, even circumstantial evidence, they used it to argue that the Abwehr needed to be shut down. They compiled files, built cases, and waited for the right moment to strike. That moment came in 1944. A series of Abwehr scandals, including the defection of several officers to the Allies and the discovery of some financial irregularities, gave Himmler the ammunition he needed. In February 1944, Hitler finally ordered the Abwehr dissolved and absorbed into the SD, now reorganized as the RSHA, the Reichssecurity Main Office. Canaris was removed from command, given a meaningless position, and effectively placed under house arrest. The organization he'd built was dismantled, with its functions taken over by the very people who had been his bitter rivals for years. For the SD, this was total victory. They'd destroyed their rival and absorbed its functions. Himmler's power was now nearly absolute in the realm of intelligence and security. But the victory was Pyrrhic, because by early 1944 Germany was already losing the war. The Battle of Stalingrad had been lost. The Allies had landed in Italy. The Eastern Front was collapsing. The massive resources spent on internal rivalry and the years of intelligence dysfunction caused by the Abwehr-SD feud had contributed to Germany's strategic failures. The story ends tragically for almost everyone involved. After the failed July 20th assassination attempt against Hitler in 1944, the Gestapo launched a massive investigation that uncovered the extent of resistance activities within the Abwehr. Hans Oster was arrested, tortured, and eventually executed. Canaris himself was arrested in July 1944 when the conspiracy investigations uncovered his connections to the plotters. He was held in various prisons and concentration camps, and in April 1945, just weeks before the war ended, he was executed on Hitler's direct orders at Flossenburg concentration camp. The SD and Gestapo's victory over the Abwehr was complete, but it was meaningless. Germany was about to be defeated. Himmler would commit suicide after being captured by the British. Kaltenbrunner would be tried at Nuremberg, convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity, and hanged. The entire apparatus of Nazi intelligence and security would be destroyed along with the regime it served. When you step back and look at this whole bizarre situation, several things become clear. First, the rivalry between the Abwehr and the Gestapo SD was fundamentally a conflict between different visions of Germany. The Abwehr, at least under Canaris, represented a more traditional, military-oriented, nationalist Germany. The Gestapo and SD represented the revolutionary, ideological, totalitarian Nazi vision. This wasn't just about bureaucratic turf wars, it was about what kind of country Germany would be. Second, the rivalry demonstrates one of the fundamental weaknesses of Nazi Germany and totalitarian systems in general. Hitler deliberately created overlapping authorities and competing power centers. He believed this competition would make his subordinates work harder and would prevent any single person from accumulating enough power to challenge him. What it actually created was chaos, inefficiency, and internal conflict that seriously weakened the German war effort. Multiple histories have been written about how Hitler's leadership style, this deliberate creation of chaos, was one of Nazi Germany's great strategic weaknesses. Third, the Abwehr-SD rivalry shows that even in totalitarian states, resistance is possible. The Abwehr became a center of opposition to Hitler precisely because it was military rather than party-based, because it had institutional protections that the SD couldn't easily breach, and because Canaris skillfully used his position to protect dissidents. The tragedy is that this resistance was ultimately unsuccessful. The plots against Hitler failed. The regime continued until it was destroyed by external force. But the fact that the resistance existed at all, that German patriots tried to stop Hitler from within, is historically significant. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly for intelligence history, the Abwehr-SD conflict demonstrates what happens when intelligence agencies become politicized. Intelligence work requires objectivity, requires telling leaders what they need to hear rather than what they want to hear. But both the Abwehr and SD became so focused on their rivalry, so concerned with political positioning, that objective intelligence gathering and analysis became secondary. Reports were written not to convey accurate information, but to score points against rivals. Operations were designed not for strategic value, but for political credit. The intelligence product became worthless because it was contaminated by internal politics. The Allies actually benefited enormously from this German dysfunction. British and American intelligence officers who studied the German system were amazed at how disorganized it was. They found that German intelligence, which they'd expected to be efficient and dangerous, was actually remarkably ineffective. Multiple Allied operations succeeded at least partly because German intelligence failed to detect them or failed to analyze the intelligence they had correctly. And much of that failure can be traced back to the Abwehr-SD rivalry and the broader dysfunction it represented. There's also a deep irony in all of this. The Gestapo and SD were created specifically to protect the Nazi regime from internal enemies. That was their core mission. And they identified the Abwehr as an internal enemy, which wasn't wrong. The Abwehr really did harbor people who opposed Hitler, but by spending years fighting the Abwehr, by devoting enormous resources to this internal conflict, the Gestapo and SD actually weakened Germany's security. They were so focused on hunting internal enemies that they failed to effectively counter external ones. They won their internal war, but helped lose the external one. Consider the human cost of this rivalry. Talented intelligence officers on both sides spent their careers fighting each other instead of fighting the Allies. Some of the brightest minds in Germany, people who might have made a difference in the war effort, were consumed by internal bureaucratic battles. People like Hans Oster, who was by all accounts a brilliant intelligence officer, devoted his talents to resisting Hitler rather than serving Germany because he saw the Nazi regime as Germany's greatest enemy. And he was right. But the tragedy is that his resistance was unsuccessful and cost him his life. The Abwehr-Gestapo rivalry also reveals something about the nature of totalitarian systems. In democracies, intelligence agencies compete too. The CIA and FBI have had famous rivalries. Britain's MI5 and MI6 have had jurisdictional disputes. Interagency competition isn't unique to dictatorships. But in democracies, there are institutional constraints, oversight mechanisms, and accountability systems that limit how destructive these rivalries can become. In Nazi Germany, there were no such constraints. The competition could spiral into open warfare because there was no authority above it except Hitler, and Hitler actively encouraged this kind of conflict. The story of the Abwehr versus the Gestapo is ultimately a story about a regime consuming itself. Nazi Germany devoted vast resources to internal surveillance, internal repression, and internal conflict. The Gestapo and SD weren't primarily focused on external enemies. They were focused on controlling the German population, hunting dissidents, and fighting rival institutions. This internal focus was a feature of the Nazi system, not a bug. It was what totalitarian regimes do. They eat themselves. And there's a final chilling point. The Abwehr-SD rivalry, the dissolution of the Abwehr, and the consolidation of all intelligence and security functions under Himmler's SS were all part of the radicalization of the Nazi regime in its final years. As the war situation deteriorated, as defeat became more likely, the regime became more paranoid, more brutal, more extreme. The destruction of the Abwehr removed one of the last institutions that had any independence from Nazi ideology. After February 1944, there was no intelligence service that could tell Hitler uncomfortable truths. There was only the SD, which was a party organization first, and an intelligence service second. This radicalization in the final year of the war led to some of the worst atrocities. The intensification of the Holocaust, the brutal repression of the July 20th conspirators and their families, the scorched earth policies in the East, all of these happened after the SD had destroyed the Abwehr and consolidated total control over intelligence and security. There is an argument to be made that the Abwehr, for all its flaws, had been a moderating influence, or at least a source of alternative perspectives. Once it was gone, the regime had removed its own internal brakes. When you look at the documents from this period, the internal memos and reports, what strikes you is how much energy went into this rivalry. Thousands of pages of accusations, counter-accusations, investigations of investigations, intelligence reports about rival intelligence officers. It's almost absurd, except it was deadly serious for the people involved. Careers were destroyed, lives were lost, and ultimately a regime was weakened, all because two intelligence agencies couldn't work together. The Abwehr versus Gestapo story is one that's often overlooked in popular histories of World War II. We focus on the big battles, the famous generals, the major turning points. But this shadow war within Nazi Germany, this battle between German spy agencies, had real consequences. It degraded German intelligence capabilities at a crucial time. It consumed resources that could have been used elsewhere. It created a climate of suspicion and fear that paralyzed decision-making. And it demonstrated that even in the most totalitarian systems, internal conflicts and human factors can overwhelm even the most sophisticated organizations. So the next time you think about World War II and Nazi Germany, remember that while the Wehrmacht was fighting the Allies on multiple fronts, behind the scenes, Germany's own intelligence agencies were fighting an equally vicious war against each other. The Abwehr and the Gestapo, organizations that should have been working together to serve German strategic interests, instead devoted themselves to mutual destruction. And in that self-destructive rivalry, we can see one of the many reasons why Nazi Germany, despite its early military successes, was ultimately doomed to defeat. An empire divided against itself cannot stand, and Nazi Germany was very much divided, consumed by internal conflicts, jealousies, and ideological purges. The Abwehr-Gestapo rivalry was just one example of this self-destructive dynamic, but it was a particularly important one because intelligence and security are supposed to be the eyes and shields of a nation. When those eyes are watching each other instead of the enemy, and those shields are turned inward instead of outward, defeat becomes not just possible, but inevitable.